Racing, speed, thrills and adrenaline is something I thrive on. Having been fortunate enough to partake in some extreme sports over my years of 2+ wheeled racing both on and off track is one of my favourite hobbies. Yep, that is my riding office, I'm afraid. When it comes to games, it's always been 4 wheels that receive the most love, which I have been known to enjoy as well in both the real and virtual world. Which brings us poetically onto the grandfather of true 3D races from the company that was at the bleeding edge of true 3D rendering. Sega was and is a proud figure in video games history and dominated both home console and arcades for a long period. Amongst its pedigree is the AM gaming division of 1, 3 and 2, led by legendary creator Yu Suzuki. Now, the name of the team came from the time they would leave the office each morning, a Japanese hard-working ethos that they took to extremes. The game that started it all was Virtua Racing that launched the Model 1 arcade boards, even though it wasn't actually labelled this at the time, not until the second board launched. Now, in 1994, it made a smash into the arcades from the AM2 team, born from his love of racing, seeing his other iconic titles from Hang On that opened this video and being a big influence on my passion for bikes, Power Drift and of course Outrun, influenced by the Cannonball Run movie. Now, the seismic shift from those pseudo 3Ds actually being 2D scaled sprites across parallax backgrounds. Now, unlike previous titles from the team that use pseudo 3D within raster graphic effects to generate the illusion of movement, this essentially involves warping a 2D image through raster line changes from scrolling or palette swaps. See how the road strips move towards you from the top to the bottom, and the edges are scrolled left to right, right to left along the raster lines. This is achieved by changing the colour or speed of the movement per line as the image is drawn onto the screen each frame. Outrun, like Hang On, had dedicated hardware for the road effect of this scanline swap. It's essentially where the term racing the beam comes from. Later made famous by the legendary SNES Mode 7 effect, although far from exclusive to the console, even though many believed it was. Now here, Yu Suzuki and crew had access to a ground-up bespoke Model 1 board, designed for high mathematic throughput, including floating point precision, perfect for the shift from raster graphics to the newer vector graphics. It was a total revelation. Now, as the game was originally a proving point of the hardware, it was so successful and popular, Sega commissioned it to become a full game in its own right, which is what we're talking about today. Now, leaving behind its Superscaler Systems board that powered all of its sprite scaling classics, this tonal shift was personified in the new model naming system, to become one of many. Now, with the older systems board being precursors to home systems with examples like the Z80 chip, yes, the very same Spectrum Legend being the core of the Master System and handling sound co-processing on the Mega Drive, whilst also allowing full backwards compatibility with it, with the family roots only extending back with the Yamaha YM3438 sound chip appearing from some of the older arcade boards also present in the Mega Drive machine. Now, the Model 1 board sported far more powerful hardware and as such could not be as cost efficiently ported to home machines like the Saturn, with a complete change of tact with the Naomi and Dreamcast systems, sporting a dedicated GPU processor to handle geometry, not unlike the PS1, and the all-important matrix function dedicated to converting 3D objects onto a 2D display. It was perfect for this new generation. Now, amongst the arcade suite of effects from alpha blending, it could also shade these polygons per vertex or flat shading. Gorage shading was not possible for it, something both the 32X and the Saturn were capable of, in addition to texture mapping, as that came later with the Model 2 boards. Now, it's not possible here, even though the board had the same tile map system that was prevalent across all 2D based systems, this being how the image on screen is constructed from a 4x4 or typically an 8x8 such grid, saving on memory, computation, among other benefits within a tile set or tile map. Now, it's not totally unlike more modern features like Far Cry's adaptive virtual texturing, mega textures, etc. Now, the other sacrifice for this early leap into 3D was the frame rate, shockingly dropped from the arcade 60Hz status quo to a mere 30Hz, a worthy cost for the success and praise the game received, and starting a trend that we have followed ever since. Now, even though Sega had not been first to the polygon punch, oh no, that honour actually sits with Atari and iRobot, which hit arcades in 1984 and was the first flat-shaded polygon game in commercial release. itself an inspiration for Mark Cerny's Marble Madness, a title which will and does deserve its own retrospective itself ahead of its time. With its early use of spatial anti-aliasing, allowed by its height map solution and therefore dynamic shadows, there's many firsts in that title. But even in this new high-end fully dynamic 3D world, Sega was still not the first. Namco and others all hit first, all for naught though, as Sega delivered the knockout blow, with a title that cemented them as the top dogs of arcade and AM2, and Yu Suzuki himself as the legends they became, with Virtua Racing the daddy of modern racing games. It cannot be under-egged. So with such pioneering technology, it was no surprise that a home version for the at the time Mega Drive, or Genesis as it was known in America, was little more than a pipe dream. But just under 2 years later, the impossible happened. It did appear on the machine in early 1994 and brought its own revolution in the shape of Sega's own coprocessor within the cartridge for full 3D polygons, dubbed the SVP, or Sega Virtual Processor, mimicking the Argonaut designed Super FX chip Nintendo had used to power its own Star Fox Starwing title. It was more powerful, and like that chip, it was expensive, costing me at the time around £65 if I recall. And I still own it today, so it was money well spent, you could say. Now, this bleeding edge tech not only was a one-off and with the game, but also the catalyst for Sega's own extension for the all-conquering Mega Drive in the shape of the ill-fated 32X, which also received its own version of the game for a few months later, entitled Virtua Racing Deluxe. Powered by two SH2 CPUs and its own VDP units and split frame buffers with 128 kilobytes combined, you see the similarities with its younger Saturn brother. But, like the Mega Drive cart, it lacked any dedicated hardware acceleration for polygons, relying on a purely software-driven renderer for the CPUs. Now, this differed in many ways from the Mega Drive original, in addition to adding 2 more cars and tracks over the game's base 3, split by easy, medium and hard. But we will cover the games in order, starting with the first release for the 16-bit machine. And just to be clear, all the footage you see here and in all my retro articles is from original hardware and titles, unless stated on screen. Emulation is still far from accurate or really genuine. I also keep them scaled as little as possible for the fully authentic feel, just using clean RGB capture from the machines with older composite RF at times, just to show the image as most viewed it. Yes, that is how we viewed the screens. Now, the expensive cartridge housed the single most impressive title on the hardware, but it was heavily assisted by the Samsung-created VSP, or in fact SSP1601 DSP, which was a fixed-point processor, not Hitachi as many believed, with a 25 MHz core clock. It ran at a native 256x192 resolution, leaving borders on the top and bottom of the screen to stop the Mega Drive groaning under the strain, but it delivers an impressive showing, and it was made specifically by the AM2 team for the console. Now, the same 3 tracks and 1 car appears from the arcade, and you can change the view across all 4 as you race in real time. A true genius touch at the time, driving home the game's draw-dropping impact. Now, as a kid, I chucked God knows how much money into this beast to live my petrol-headed dreams, but once I could do the same in my house, it was on another level, commencing the end of the arcade dream, ironically for Sega's own hands. Now, visually, it was far from identical to the arcade. Dithering was used across the entire game's coloured shading to improve the Mega Drive's basic simultaneous 15 on-screen colours and 9-bit display from its base 512 palette, which could extend to 1536 with a shadow and highlights mode. Tricks like this were used, such as palette swaps, mid-raster, famously used on Sonic. Now, this mixed the colour scheme up and is similar to the mesh mode used in Saturn titles to mimic transparency within VDP-1 objects. Now, along with it being very common on Mega Drive and Genesis titles as a whole. And like this effect, it has to be taken into display time, with most having an RF lead. Or such on a cheap CRT. This would convince well for extra colour and translucency, if not totally. It was also used for just that on the Mega Drive title, delivering around 168 unique colours on screen per frame. But even though it came with a dedicated chip, it still stood little chance of hitting the Model 1's 180,000 polygons per second peak rate, falling short by a mere 172,000 or thereabouts primitives, with a peak approximate of around 6,000 to 9,000 per second. Now, this clearly resulted in much simpler car models' background terrain, along with a much shorter draw distance, considering this was all on a machine powered by a Motorola 68000 CPU that could hit a whopping 7.6 MHz. it was a colossal achievement for Sega and the machine itself, selling pretty well, something sadly not true of its much improved enhancement in the 32X. Now, being the first true generation straddling add-on, it was not only short-lived, expensive, poorly supported, but it also sold terribly. A full house, you may say. Now, this in part helped keep the 32X version far less common and enjoyed at its host base, which is a shame, as this was the most accurate port of the title by far for the time. None of them hit the heavily marketed arcade perfect tagline of the day, but it was as close as you could get without cigarette butts, half-drunk Coke cans, and people leaning in your view. Now, surprisingly, resolution was only marginally improved from its Mega Drive cousin on the horizontal axis, up by 64 pixels to 320 by 192. They both actually draw a 240 high image, but cooled with a border at the same point. Now, this gives around 25% pixel improvement from 49,152 Mega Drive pixels to the 32X's 61,440. And this is just the start of the boosts it delivers. Now, colour increases to 256 on-screen colours afforded by its 15-bit palette and 32,768 range. Now, this helped the flat shaded polygons closer resemble the Model 1 release. Now, the title could have used one of the secret features of the 32X, its multiple graphics modes, and one of those was the run length mode, which allowed it to have a 16 bits per pixel colour palette and giving it 256 on screen. Whether it did or did not use this, something you can see on screen from my 32X, is up for debate. But most of the time, including this machine and all previous 8-bit and 16-bit machines, use CLUTs, which is basically colour lookup tables to handle their colour palettes. What is clear is the game is far brighter and the colour palette is greatly extends across the 32X from its Mega Drive cousin, and this also extends into the polygon pushing power, giving around 50,000 per second, leaving the Mega Drive displaying only 13% of its bigger brother. A draw distance is not substantially improved though, and pop-in is an issue on both machines equally. It's helped on the 32X with its clearer display and more detailed geometry though. Most likely the game's polygons are constructed of quads, just like the Model 1 and Model 2 boards used, along with the Saturn, but being a software renderer they could have used plain triangles on either machine, but that would be unlikely due to the fact the original team ported both and this is what they were used to. You've got to remember at this point, it wasn't well known that triangles were going to succeed in rendering. Quads was still an option, and Sega were at the forefront of 3D rendering technology with this very title. Now, shocked at the new 30Hz level from the arcade, the Mega Drive version operates at just over half that level with a mere 16Hz update, but this is consistent and locked at all times. But it's not that simple, as on real hardware the update is not so straightforward. The game has to share the VDP of the Mega Drive, so it interleaves the on-screen between the DSP and the bulk of the screen contents of polygons, and then the HUD of the timer and speed. Finally, the scrolling background is updated. As you can see, this is not always moving. Now, this results and shows that in theory the game still updates at 50Hz, just like all PAL Mega Drive titles. But as the work is offloaded between the cart processor and the 68000, each section runs around 16Hz. This is in the figures most quoted on sites, but are based on close but inaccurate emulators that can never show the true picture on most hardware. Although Kiga is by far the best and it is pretty much as accurate as you can get. As far as driving and scenery updates go though, it does operate around 16 FPS consistently, even though, to be accurate, the screen updates between 30 and 40 FPS. Changing views, flipping the car, or flying like an eagle, the engine and the VSP never falters on its render rate. Now, some of the lack in refresh rate is managed from its short height, giving it more time to draw on the V-blank stage when the CRT beam or gun returns from the bottom right to top left. In comparison, the 32X version zips along at a blistering rate of 17 FPS, but does not have to rely on interleaved update aside the also two-player option. In isolation, the Mega Drive Genesis version does become manageable and you accept it. Though far from smooth at the time, this was a bold new ground and was a leap into a new world. Cockpit view and back is much harder to play due to the slow update, blocky view, fast simulation and popping, giving you very short reaction time and almost impossible to see ahead. Now, this is greatly improved on the Mushroom expansion, though with a smoother update and clearer visuals helped by a higher resolution and colour. Through a genuine RF hookup, you have a game that can really take you back. Ooh, You just gotta love that interference. Now you can see perfectly here the benefit of a clean RGB feed delivers from the Mega Drive, and even more so as you move into the more modern hardware. Switching to the Saturn belies the 32% boost in frame rate, as it can feel silky smooth in comparison when you have. Now it holds this rate reasonably well throughout play of the arcade tracks, and again this includes the far superior visual quality and polygon count. But the machine did house dual 32-bit RISC processors in the form of the SH2s, and alongside other game additions it was a huge leap over the other. Cars now had far more details, mountains contained more information and vertices, and it looks more like its cleaner arcade roots. As the Mega Drive fed its AV through the 32X, it did not sit idle when running these add-on titles. Displaying the entire background, scrolling layer and overlay is all being generated by the main console, and as such is a near identical composition as the Mega Drive version, complete with low colour banding. Now all polygons and objects are running on the SH2s and VDP inside the mushroom-shaped beast. The scope and possibilities of this hybrid symbiotic relationship had huge potential, but sadly largely went underused, with some shocking titles that barely used the resource, an issue that also plagued the more successful Mega CD or Sega CD add-on. Now all versions highlight the big problem when you move from pixel constructed sprites and tile set multi-layered backgrounds into full 3D objects, and that is pixelization. Aliasing is far more of an issue. But the simple and clean layout of the shaded polys here does go a long way to resolve those issues. Colour and clarity are the biggest visual differences between the two releases, something that cannot be said of the Mega Drive release of Virtua Fighter 2 and its earlier Virtua Fighter 32X title mind. Now the Saturn release was the most feature packed, aside the fact that the 32X version is the only one that allows you to zoom in and out during the Sky camera replays. It's made up for in other areas. Adding even more over the base and turtleneck plugin release was not really a better title for it. Now before the console's release, much was made of the fact that it was actually more powerful than the Model 1 hardware this title was created for. In some ways, very true, being capable of far more hardware features and texture map graphics, a mutation between the Model 1 and 2 boards, but shared more of its internals from the 32X drawing board, including split buffers and dual CPUs across one bus. It also shows that paper specs are not all they are made out to be, as it could deliver around 500,000 flat shaded polygons over twice the amount of Model 1. Even texture map, this was 200,000. The downside is that this was all within the VDP-1 GPU, and to use the machine as intended, both this and its more 2D based VDP-2 were required. Now clearly designed to have a powerful 2D multiplane GPU that could run 7 independent parallax backgrounds, including dual rotation and scaling across a range of colours and sizes, then a dedicated sprite or 3D handler that could also scale, rotate, shade and texture, among other features, working in unison to deliver the best of both worlds. It just had a bigger footprint in Sega's 2D continuation. It did not factor in the simplicity of the PSX and its far more intuitive development tools and knowledge base. But with a title like Virtua Fighter or Racing, it should deliver arcade perfection now, shouldn't it? Sadly not, and although far from the Daytona USA travesty, it still fell short of its arcade rival, and in some ways its 32X cousin. Colours improve even more, with over 32,000 on screen at once, using its 24-bit colour depth, and although the arcade itself most likely never hit the theoretical 180,000 polys per second, it came closer than the Saturn release, or at least the quads were not as distributed as well. Performance is closest so far, with a target 25 FPS here, and it holds that rate well across the arcade sections with minor dips to 22, but the title's extra tracks dipping as low as 16 from my performance tool test, and suffers from depth issues as your car is never cooled by geometry or even other cars. Obviously this lacks a Z buffer in hardware, meant that titles needed to incorporate a software solution, and Time Warner, who released the game, did not have the time. Oh, the irony. This was not an in-house port by Sega's AM2 team, unlike the Mega Drive title. But it did improve the base game with a further 2 cars and tracks and a full GP mode, allowing you to race from go-karts to F1. Music and sound was enhanced by the Saturn CD audio and vastly improved sound capabilities, along with flyovers, varied in-game custom options. You can hear the difference to compare to the Mega Drive's low sample rate, delivering its trademark hissy speech and engine sounds. Like the visual quality, the sound also scales through the generations, with the Mega Drive unsurprisingly being last. Now the 32X also has the same limitations, so it's hardly that much better. Very similar levels of compression, but it's slightly cleaner, and you now get slightly better soundtracks, but it still has the same hiss. You do benefit from the extra CPU, allowing it to have more processing and therefore reverb on the sound when you go into tunnels. The Saturn is by far the better sounding of all though, with its CD quality soundtrack, much clearer speech and sound effects, but engine sounds are still very weak. In terms of audio quality, it's much better than the other two, but it's hardly going to set your motor racing. But it did lack the two-player racing from the Mega Drive and 32X versions, right for taking around your mates on a Saturday night for some domination. A minor loss, but still a useful option within this non-internet world. It also lacked the ability to scale the sky camera in replays, as that was an exclusive feature to the 32X version. And aside the extra content, fleshed out modes and brighter palettes and superior performance, it did and does not feel as accurate or as fun as the 32X version that achieved the closest version of its arcade hero. It did improve in other ways, with physics now being more accurate and incorporating terrain undulation and speed, taking off over humps causing momentary loss of control. It did add to the skill required in winning. Many years later, the PS2 itself did receive its own and further enhanced VR title that was visually close to the Model 1 board a home release has ever come, with it in actual fact running at 60 Hz. It's arguably the best technical version made in that regard. It also incorporates additional features like cube map reflections on the bonnet of the car. It also added far more modes and a stunt section to help increase the longevity. Sadly, I do not own the title for my PS2, and as such I am showing here briefly under emulation, which gives you an idea of the title and how it looked. Now if I do manage to get the copy, I will of course update this, but it was nearly 7 years after the original. It only serves as a closing chapter to the AM2 delights and long-running heritage of the father of modern racing and indeed modern 3D gaming. Virtua Racing from Sega was an absolute milestone in real-time rendering, pioneering many techniques and perfecting many others. It stands as a true icon in not only Sega's own heritage, but in the Video Game Hall of Fame, being one of my most cherished arcade titles, and I'm sure many of you guys watching this video.
The fact that it even appeared on the Mega Drive, editions or not, is remarkable.
From pedigree in history as wide and diverse as AM2 and Yu Suzuki, the fact that Virtua Racing is one of only many titles that stand proud in video games history, this really has been a trip down memory lane and a title that is as impressive now as it was the day I first clunked it into my console. Now in the very next episode of Retro Perspective, we grab some plants, coins and rifles and risk our very existence diving into a game that surely holds the record of the most non-exclusive exclusive ever made. Leon Kennedy leads us deep into another groundbreaker in Resident Evil 4 and every version, well major, ever released. Now as always, if you enjoyed this or anything else that I've put together, please hit the like and subscribe button, as it really helps me immensely and I appreciate each and every one of you that does. Follow me on Twitter, visit more on the website, and click a downvote if you don't enjoy what I do, but please try to tell me what you don't like. You guys and girls take care, play fast, game hard, and I'll see you in the retro.
To be this virtuous takes Virtua Racing. To be this good takes...